We're gonna have a nice little video outside. It's very hot and muggy today in central Virginia, but it is a very peaceful and serene setting. So I want to talk today about another video about bipolar remission and the kind of challenges I face with that. It's been almost 3 months now. We're closing in on 3 months of remission. Just in case you haven't watched my other videos, I've had bipolar disorder pretty much my whole life. I was diagnosed at 20, but I had boredom before that as a child, so I kind of had sub-threshold symptoms even through my teen years. And I'm 41 now, so I've been suffering from this illness for 20 years. And the interesting thing about a sick identity is, you don't really have, when you go into remission, you don't really have an identity outside of the illness. If someone has, say, cancer from 35 to 40 until they beat it, they can their life isn't the same, but they can kind of go back to 35. They still have that wealth of adult experiences of being illness-free to draw from. But I've found that there are very few cases, and I've searched for them, very few recollections and narrations of people actually talking about having, say, a metabolic illness for a couple decades or most of their life, and then, going into remission from it, and how they navigate their life differently, how they adapt, how they adjust. So the really good thing about, not being ill is not being ill. That's fantastic. I would definitely never trade remission for being sick again, because when you go into remission, you can see just how ill you were. When you're ill, you don't really see it. There's just different gradients of functioning. And I do consider myself, or formerly, a very high-functioning person with bipolar disorder. Someone who does have all their ducks in a row, but the difference now is just night and day. There is no comparison. It's like calling someone a functional alcoholic versus a non-alcoholic. Who wants to be a functioning alcoholic when you can just be free of the alcohol altogether? But I will say that there are challenges when dealing with remission. And the big challenge is you don't really know who you are without the illness. The other interesting thing I noticed is the chronological age issue. On the one hand, I am 41 years old. I have many of the same priorities, thoughts, fears, ideas as a typical 41-year-old of my generation. So I have that identity as a person, but I also have kind of an older person's identity, someone who's in their 70s, 80s, or 90s, who's had, someone at that age has to focus pretty much exclusively on just maintaining their health. They're on their way out in this life. Typically, elderly people have a lot of medical problems that they have to deal with, and so they have to be very focused on their health at all times just to maintain their daily activities. And then you also have the person in their 20s, their early adulthood, who never got to experience all those moments. They never got to form the friendships. They never got to form the romantic entanglements. They never got to form the professional connections because their whole life was just consumed with managing this illness for 2 decades. And so I find myself simultaneously in a state where I'm a person who's in their 80s, I'm a person who's 41, and I'm a person who's in their 20s at the same time. So it's very confusing because you're like, I'm not really any of these people. I'm a combination of them, but it feels like you're 3 separate people at the same time. So I've been trying to figure out how to navigate this. I've been trying to use AI a little to help me out because, like I said, I can't even find any real stories that people have published about this or like guidebooks. You think there would be a handbook somewhere to dealing with this, and I haven't been able to find one yet. So I just try to take time for every one of those selves, because I can't really ignore any of them. I can't ignore the 80-year-old because the 80-year-old is the guy that makes the decisions to prioritize my health, In other words, I can't just abandon my diet if my diet is a primary indicator. I need to make sure that I'm eating those meals, the right meals at the right times every day. I need to follow through on my social rhythm therapy. I need to take my supplements every day, just like an older person. Well, I got to take my blood pressure medication every morning, just to get through my day. Well, I got to take my supplements every morning. So you have to honor that 80-year-old self, but you also have to minimize it because you're not just focused on your health anymore. The 41-year-old, I have to focus on the basic, challenges, the the exploration, the finances, focus enough on the future for when I do hit 60. And then the 20s is a little more challenging because I have to set out the time to become more playful. I have to set out the time to, make room for that younger self that I lost. You can't sit in that sick identity though, because I'd be biking around some college campuses when I'm exploring somewhere. And there is like a lively energy there, and I did go to college for a couple years. It didn't work out for me. And then I completed my bachelor's degree, 15 years later online. But I do feel kind of robbed of that experience. And loss, when you have that sick identity, is very common. So it's just about focusing on, but I can't go back to being 20 either because I'm not 20. I mean, let's assume a hypothetical scenario where I went back to college as an undergraduate, completely ridiculous. I wouldn't enjoy myself. There'd be certain aspects of me that would want to explore, but then my 41-year-old self would win over and be like, oh, this is so silly. These are people just entering adulthood. So I think the important thing when you're trying to explore that version of yourself in your 20s is just finding the little wonderment, doing the little small challenges. Take time to do something a little silly. Take time to do something a little adventurous. You don't have to go all out. Just making these videos is a very silly thing. This is something that the 41-year-old self would be, oh, this is so stupid. What is ever going to come out of you making any videos? Nobody's going to watch these videos. And the 80-year-old self is like, well, there's much more important things to prioritize with the time you have left. Well, I got a lot of time left. I got at least 40 to 50 years left. So I got to kind of ignore that. You kind of got to put those other identities at the side and just set aside time to be that young version of yourself that missed out on those opportunities. So that's just something interesting I wanted to talk about, that kind of split, that chronological split that you'll probably experience if you ever do go into remission from any type of long-term illness. And I just want to continue documenting the process of kind of reintegrating myself into, not society, but integrating myself into a more fulfilling version of myself, a version of myself that is more multifaceted, and has a rich, inner life and a richer social life. So I guess that's going to be the end of the video today.